Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. Stuart Nash.
Thank you much, Mr Speaker. Labor will be supporting this bill to select committee. I do believe that there are some great initiatives in here, but I'm very keen to hear what the public has to say about this. But, Mr Speaker, one thing that I think the government could really do to drive innovation is actually lead by example. Now, it would have been a couple of months ago that Mr Bridges, as the Minister, was on television in a great photo opportunity and actually a news opportunity promoting the registration of the 1,000th electric vehicle. It was a great piece of news because we need to encourage this. But, Mr Speaker, the interesting thing about this is Mr Bridges turned up to this photo opportunity in this huge, big diesel BMW, got out, had the photo taken, cut the ribbon, jumped back in this huge, big diesel BMW and drove back to Parliament. I would have thought, Mr Speaker, that the best way to really provide innovation, the greatest way to show that the government is serious about this, and certainly when it comes to electric vehicles, is to at least have the Minister of Energy driven around in an electric vehicle. I would have thought, Mr Speaker, that the Crown fleet should all be electric vehicles, and there is absolutely no reason why it should not be. In fact, Mr Speaker, I was talking to a gentleman who knows Elon Musk very well. Now, Elon Musk is the chap who owns Tesla motor vehicles. These are incredibly efficient cars. They're very fast cars. They're actually very sexy cars. They are fantastic cars. And I was talking to this gentleman about the fact that the government talks about electric vehicles and drives these diesels. And I said, half jokingly, but half seriously, you know what, the Crown fleet should be Teslas. The Crown fleet should be Teslas. And this chap said, well, I reckon that if the Crown went to Elon Musk and said that we want to replace our fleet with a fleet of electric Teslas, Elon Musk would be up for it. He said, I can't speak on behalf of him, but he said, imagine picking up global dignitaries in a Tesla at the airport and fully electric vehicles. Now, Mr Bennett, that is leading by example. That is leading by example. Bringing a piece of legislation to the House is all very well, and I like the intent behind this, but the government has a very important role to play in driving innovation in this sector. Because, Mr Speaker, I don't know what the future is going to look like in this, but what we do know is change is happening very quickly. What I also know that the world of electricity is going to look incredibly different in 10 years' time than it does now, and we need to be on top of this. So I think, Mr Speaker, I would stand up and I would applaud the Minister if he had given that speech, as he drives around, as he can say, I drive an electric vehicle, but he can't. He stands up and gives a speech about the importance of electric vehicles, yet he doesn't drive one. He stands up and says it's important that the government's in charge of innovation, and yet they don't innovate. Mr Speaker, the government fleet, is, according to the Parliamentary Library, is around about 17,000 vehicles, give or take a few. Imagine this. Imagine if the government had a policy where it said we're going to have an opt-out policy as opposed to an opt-in around every car in the government fleet being electric. Now let's make an assumption that there are 15,000 Crown cars that have the potential to be electric in the government fleet, and let's also make an assumption that they're on 3-by-1-year leases, which is your stock standard corporate government lease. Let's also make one more assumption, Mr Speaker, that they have a lifespan of around about 5 years after their 3-year of government lease. Mr Speaker, if the government led by example in this area, there could be 40,000 electric vehicles on our roads simply through government behaviour, simply through government doing the right thing. And yet, Mr Speaker, it doesn't, or it won't. And that's why I find it quite rich that the Minister of Energy can stand up here and talk about what they are going to do with electric vehicles, and yet they don't use them. That is a real shame. And I think that they actually should. I think the government should be really driving innovation, and pardon the pun, in this sector. Mr Speaker, this plays into actually our global brand, because we go out there with this clean green image, and yet Sir Paul Callaghan himself once said, and I quote, We believe we have a clean economy and a clean green image and do not see the lack of honesty which surrounds this branding. We are merely a small population spread over a large area which provides an impression of clean green, end quote. This is where the government needs to play a role, Mr. Speaker. This is where the government can make a difference, Mr. Bennett, and yet it won't. But having said that, this legislation is a step in the right direction, a small one when they could take a giant one. It is a small step. But, Mr. Speaker, when the Minister again talks about what the government is doing and the way they are innovating, I just go back to the facts. There is something called the World Energy Council. And the World Energy Council, it's a highly renowned body, and the Minister is often quotes the World Energy Council. They have something called the Energy Trilemma Index. And, Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years, in terms of energy equity, that's basically the affordability of electricity for the whole population, we've dropped from 18th in the world to 28th. In terms of environmental sustainability, we've dropped from 36th to 42nd. We're not doing what is necessary to play into our global brand, which is in essence our global competitive advantage. It's why people overseas buy Fonterra milk and Fonterra cheese as opposed to milk and cheese from other countries around the world, because the image that goes with our brand is worth, well, in 2005, the then Ministry of Economic Development valued our brand at $20 billion a year, and that was over 10 years ago. And the one thing that this government has not done enough of, Mr. Speaker, is work incredibly hard to enhance that brand to play into our global competitive advantage. But that's why we are supporting this bill, because it's a start. It's a start. I mean, if we can allow electric vehicles to drive down bus lanes, well, so be it. There's 1,000 electric vehicles, there should be 10,000. The Minister talked about Norway. Every taxi in Norway is a Tesla, Mr. Speaker. This is the sort of stuff that the government should really be doing to drive innovation in this sector. Mr. Speaker, when I read that the bill is designed to expand ECA's mandate, I have no problem with that, because I think ECA has done a pretty good job so far in looking at ways to drive energy efficiency. But what cannot happen, Mr. Speaker, is for ECA to become too diverse or too wide in its mandate, but not be given the resources to do a really good job. ECA, I think, my personal view is they dropped the ball when they didn't provide a submission in the government's proposed transition pricing methodology. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you one area where innovation really is driven, and an area that has great concerns about the change this government's making. It's called the Independent Electricity Generators Association. This association represents about 40 small businesses that own electricity generation plants connected to the local distribution network. This brings diversity to local sources of energy. It drives innovation, and yet this sector is very concerned about the changes that the government is bringing into the sector. But this is a sector where innovation occurs. And this is a sector we actually need to be providing a level of regulatory support for, not undermining them in a way that could, in effect, stifle innovation. Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that this is a very innovative sector. And there is no doubt in some areas we're at the top of our game. In terms of electricity generation, we're second behind Norway. We do very well there. We could do better. Transportation, though, and I've no doubt my colleague Dr. Megan Woods will talk about this, about 54% of our greenhouse gases come from our transport sector. Anything that will drive innovation in that space is welcomed. There is no doubt about that, Mr. Speaker, but I'll just go back to my final point that I would like to have as the takeaway. The government should be leading by example in this. This legislation is a case of do as I say, don't do as I do. The Minister would gain significant credibility, not only with the opposition, but also with the general public, who he's trying to convince, if he started driving a Crown car that was fully electric. That, Mr. Speaker, is a government leading by example. Thank you very much.